The day I found out my sister had been stealing from my cancer treatment fund was the same day I discovered she'd been living a lie that would eventually bring the IRS knocking at both our doors. What started as a family betrayal during my darkest hour turned into a federal investigation that exposed secrets I never saw coming. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. 3 years ago, when Dr. Martinez delivered the news that would change everything, I was sitting in that sterile oncology office in downtown Phoenix, gripping the arms of a chair that had probably heard 1,000 similar conversations. Stage 3 breast cancer. Aggressive treatment needed immediately. The numbers he rattled off, chemotherapy cycles, radiation sessions, surgical procedures, all blurred together until he mentioned the cost. Even with insurance, we were looking at nearly $40,000 out of pocket. I remember calling my sister Vanessa that evening from my apartment balcony, watching the Arizona sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. She lived just 20 minutes away in Tempe, but our relationship had always been complicated. Vanessa was the successful one, the marketing executive with the pristine townhouse, the BMW, and what seemed like an endless stream of designer clothes and expensive vacations. Meanwhile, I was scraping by as a freelance graphic designer, barely making rent most months. "Rachel, oh my God," she said when I told her about the diagnosis. Her voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since we were kids. "What do you need? How can I help?" That's when she suggested something that seemed too generous to be real. She wanted to set up a GoFundMe campaign for my medical expenses and handle all the logistics herself. Vanessa had connections, she said, people with money who might contribute. Her company had corporate social responsibility programs. She knew how to write compelling fundraising copy that would really pull at heartstrings. "You just focus on getting better," she insisted. "Let me handle the money stuff. I'm good at this kind of thing." I was hesitant at first. Taking charity felt like admitting defeat, and I'd always been fiercely independent. But as the medical bills started rolling in and my freelance work became impossible to maintain during treatment, I realized I didn't have a choice. Vanessa created the campaign page with professional-looking photos and a story that made me cry when I read it. She called it "Help Rachel Fight for Her Life" and set the goal at $50,000 to cover not just the immediate medical costs, but also living expenses during my treatment. The response was overwhelming. Within the first week, donations poured in from family friends, former colleagues, and complete strangers who'd been moved by the story. Vanessa sent me daily updates, screenshots of new donations, messages from supporters, running totals that climbed higher than I dared to hope. By the end of the first month, we'd raised over $35,000. "See," Vanessa said during one of her visits to my apartment, where I was recovering from my second round of chemo, "I told you people would want to help. You've got an army of supporters out there." She handled everything seamlessly. The money went into a dedicated account she'd set up, and whenever I needed funds for medical bills or basic expenses, I'd text her the amount and she'd transfer it to my checking account within hours. It felt like having a personal financial manager, and for the first time since my diagnosis, I could focus entirely on treatment without the constant anxiety about money. But as the months passed, I started noticing small inconsistencies. When I asked to see the GoFundMe dashboard myself, Vanessa said the platform was being glitchy and she was working with their support team to fix the access issues. When I wanted to send personal thank you notes to some of the larger donors, she said she'd handle it because she had all their contact information organized in a system I wouldn't understand. The first real red flag came during my 4th month of treatment. I'd seen on social media that my former boss at the design agency had apparently made a significant donation. Several people had shared posts about it, praising him for supporting me. But when I mentioned it to Vanessa, she looked confused. "Oh, that donation? Yeah, that came through a different platform," she said quickly. "Some donors prefer to give through private channels for tax reasons. I've been managing multiple funding streams to maximize what we can raise." It sounded plausible enough, but something about her explanation felt off. Vanessa had always been a smooth talker, but there was a new nervousness in her voice when discussing the fundraising details. She'd change the subject quickly or suddenly remember urgent work calls whenever I pressed for specifics. By my 6th month of treatment, I was feeling stronger and more alert. The brain fog from chemo was lifting, and I started paying closer attention to things I'd been too sick to question before. That's when I realized I hadn't received any direct messages or emails from donors in weeks. For a campaign that was supposedly still active and growing, the silence seemed strange. One afternoon, while Vanessa was visiting and had stepped out to take a work call, I decided to check the GoFundMe page myself. What I found made my blood run cold. According to the public page, the campaign had only raised $18,000, less than half of what Vanessa had been telling me. Worse, the last donation had been posted over 2 months ago. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the donor list. Names I recognized were there, but the amounts were different from what Vanessa had reported. Some people she'd claimed had donated weren't listed at all. The math didn't add up, and a sick feeling in my stomach told me it wasn't just a technical error. When Vanessa came back inside, I confronted her directly. "I looked at the GoFundMe page," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The numbers don't match what you've been telling me." Her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, panic, then something that looked almost like relief. She sat down heavily on my couch and put her head in her hands. "Rachel, I can explain," she started, but I cut her off. "Explain what? That you've been lying to me about how much money people donated to help save my life?" What came out next was a confession that shattered what little trust I had left in my family. Vanessa admitted that she'd been inflating the donation amounts from the beginning. When the campaign started gaining traction, she'd gotten caught up in the momentum and began exaggerating the totals to make me feel more supported and hopeful. She'd been supplementing the real donations with her own money at first, she claimed, planning to pay herself back once the campaign grew larger. But then her own financial situation had gotten complicated. Her marketing company was restructuring, and she'd been worried about potential layoffs. She'd started using some of the fundraising money for her own expenses, just temporarily, she insisted, just until she could sort out her work situation and pay it all back. "How much?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I can pay it back," she said quickly. "I just need a little more time. My company is offering early retirement packages, and there's this consultant role that's basically guaranteed." "How much, Vanessa?" She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "About 12,000, but Rachel, I swear I was going to—" I stopped listening. $12,000. Money that people had donated specifically to help me survive cancer. Money that was supposed to pay for medications and treatments and basic necessities while I fought for my life. Money that my sister had stolen to cover her own expenses while watching me worry about whether I'd have enough funds to complete my treatment. The betrayal cut deeper than the cancer ever had. Cancer was random, unfair, but ultimately not personal. This was my own sister choosing to steal from me at my most vulnerable moment. It was a violation that made me question everything I thought I knew about our relationship, about her character, about my own judgment. But as devastating as that discovery was, it was only the beginning. What I didn't know yet was that Vanessa's financial problems went far beyond borrowing from my cancer fund. The lies she'd been telling me were just the tip of an iceberg that was about to surface in ways neither of us could have anticipated. The weeks following my confrontation with Vanessa felt like living in an alternate reality. She'd left my apartment that day promising to have the money transferred back within a week, but the deadline came and went without a word from her. When I tried calling, she'd either let it go to voicemail or give me vague updates about processing delays and paperwork complications. My oncologist, Dr. Martinez, had scheduled a crucial follow-up surgery that required a $5,000 upfront payment. The hospital's financial coordinator, a kind woman named Mrs. Chen, had been working with me for months on payment plans, but this procedure couldn't be delayed. I found myself in the humiliating position of having to explain that the money I'd been promised from my cancer fund wasn't actually available. I understand these situations can be complex, Mrs. Chen said diplomatically during our phone call. Would you like to explore other financing options? Other financing options meant medical credit cards with crushing interest rates or loans that would take years to pay off. I'd watched my treatment fund grow to what I thought was nearly $50,000, only to discover it was all smoke and mirrors created by the person I'd trusted most. That's when I made the decision to hire a lawyer. David Kowalski came recommended by a friend who'd used him for a business dispute. He was a no-nonsense attorney in his 50s with a reputation for being thorough and direct. When I explained the situation during our initial consultation, he listened without interruption, taking detailed notes. Before we discuss your sister's theft, I need to ask some important questions about the fundraising setup, he said. Did Vanessa register this as a legitimate charitable organization? How were the taxes being handled? What kind of documentation do you have about the donations? I realized I had almost no documentation. Everything had been filtered through Vanessa, and I'd trusted her to handle the legal and financial aspects. The few screenshots she'd sent me of donation totals are stored in my phone, but I had no access to bank statements, tax records, or official communications with the fundraising platform. This is more complicated than simple theft, David explained. If your sister was misrepresenting donation amounts and using the money for personal expenses, we're potentially looking at fraud. And if she wasn't reporting this income properly to the IRS, that opens up an entirely different set of problems. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. He recommended that I first try to recover the stolen money through direct negotiation, documenting everything in writing. If that failed, we could pursue civil action, but he warned me that criminal charges might also be warranted depending on what we discovered. I sent Vanessa a formal email outlining exactly what I knew and what I expected. I gave her 10 days to return the $12,000 and provide complete documentation of all donations and expenses. Her response came 3 days later, not from her personal email, but from what appeared to be a lawyer's office. The letter was cold and legalistic, claiming that Vanessa had been acting as a volunteer administrator for my medical fundraising, and that any money she'd used had been administrative fees and reimbursements for expenses during campaign management. It suggested that I had been fully informed of these arrangements and that my current claims were without merit. Reading that letter felt like being slapped. Not only was she refusing to return the money, but she was trying to rewrite history to make it seem like I'd somehow agreed to let her take a cut of my cancer donations. The woman who'd held my hand during chemotherapy sessions was now hiding behind lawyers rather than having a direct conversation about what she'd done. David's response was swift and comprehensive. He filed a civil lawsuit and began the process of subpoenaing financial records from both Vanessa and the fundraising platforms. But more importantly, he made a report to the IRS about potential tax fraud. If Vanessa had been using donated money for personal expenses without proper reporting, she could be facing federal charges. The IRS takes unreported income very seriously, he explained during one of our meetings. If your sister received $50,000 in donations but only reported $18,000, she's got a serious problem. And if she was claiming personal expenses as business deductions while simultaneously using donated money for those same expenses, that's tax fraud. As David's investigation progressed, the scope of Vanessa's deception became clearer. She hadn't just been stealing from my cancer fund, she'd been running what amounted to a financial shell game for years. Through subpoenaed bank records, we discovered that she'd set up multiple fundraising campaigns for various causes, always positioning herself as the administrator who would handle the money. There had been a campaign for a local family whose house burned down.
Vanessa had raised $8,000 and delivered only $4,000 to the family, claiming the rest went to administrative costs. Another campaign for a coworker's child who needed surgery had similar discrepancies. My case wasn't an isolated incident of desperation during a family crisis. It was part of a pattern of systematic fraud. The most shocking discovery came when David's forensic accountant examined Vanessa's tax returns for the past 3 years. She'd been reporting a much higher income than her marketing job actually provided, but the source of that additional income was never properly documented. The forensic accountant believed she'd been supplementing her salary with skimmed fundraising money for years, treating these campaigns like a personal ATM. Your sister wasn't just stealing from you, David told me during a particularly difficult meeting. She was stealing from everyone who trusted her to help people in crisis, and she was evading taxes on hundreds of thousands of dollars in unreported income. The IRS investigation moved faster than I'd expected. Within 6 weeks of David's initial report, federal agents were contacting everyone who'd ever donated to any of Vanessa's campaigns. They wanted detailed records of contributions, communications, and any documentation donors had about how their money was supposed to be used. I received a call from Agent Sarah Williams, a soft-spoken woman who specialized in tax fraud cases. She explained that they were building a comprehensive case against Vanessa and needed my cooperation as both a victim and a witness. Ms. Thompson, I want you to understand that your sister is likely facing serious federal charges. Tax evasion, wire fraud, mail fraud, we're looking at potential prison time. But your case is particularly egregious because of the medical nature of the donations. The investigation revealed that Vanessa had been using sophisticated methods to hide her fraudulent income. She'd set up multiple bank accounts, used different variations of her name, and had been transferring money between accounts to make tracking difficult. She'd even claimed some of the stolen money as business expenses for her consulting work, essentially getting tax deductions for money she'd already stolen. Meanwhile, my own financial situation was becoming desperate. The surgery I'd needed had to be postponed twice while I tried to secure funding. My health insurance was threatening to drop me if I couldn't make my premium payments, which had been coming from the money I no longer had access to. The stress was affecting my recovery. My latest blood tests showed concerning changes that my doctor attributed to the emotional trauma I was experiencing. The breaking point came when Vanessa reached out directly, ignoring her lawyer's advice. She called me at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, crying and begging me to make this all go away. "Rachel, please," she sobbed into the phone. "The IRS is freezing my accounts. They're talking about seizing my house. I never meant for it to go this far. I was going to pay everything back, I swear."
For a moment, hearing her break down like that, I felt a flicker of the old sympathy I'd always had for my sister. But then I remembered sitting in that hospital financial coordinator's office, having to explain why I couldn't pay for life-saving treatment because my own family member had stolen the money donated for exactly that purpose. "You weren't going to pay it back, Vanessa," I said quietly. "You've been doing this for years to other people. This isn't about desperation or temporary financial problems. This is who you are." She hung up after that, and I never received another direct call from her again. 2 days later, Agent Williams called with an update that would change everything about how I viewed the entire situation. The IRS had completed their analysis of Vanessa's financial records, and the scope of her fraud was far beyond anything we'd initially suspected. She hadn't just been stealing from fundraising campaigns, she'd been running a complex scheme involving fake business expenses, unreported income, and fraudulent tax returns that spanned nearly a decade. "Miss Thompson," Agent Williams said, "I need to prepare you for what's coming next. Your sister is about to be indicted on 18 federal charges, and we're going to need your testimony to help put her away." The federal courthouse in downtown Phoenix felt like stepping into a different world, all marble columns and serious-faced people in expensive suits carrying briefcases that probably cost more than my monthly rent. I'd never imagined I'd be walking into a building like this as a key witness in a federal fraud case, especially not against my own sister. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michelle Rodriguez had been preparing me for weeks for what would happen during the grand jury proceedings. She was a sharp woman in her early 40s who'd built her career prosecuting white-collar crimes, and she didn't mince words about the gravity of Vanessa's situation. Your sister is looking at potentially 15 to 20 years in federal prison, she explained during one of our preparation sessions. Tax evasion alone carries a maximum of 5 years per count, and we have evidence of violations spanning 7 years. Add in the wire fraud, mail fraud, and the aggravating factor that she was stealing from medical fundraisers, and we're talking about serious time. The investigation had uncovered a web of financial crimes that went back to 2018. Vanessa had been systematically skimming money from charitable campaigns, creating fake business expenses, and hiding income in a network of accounts that investigators were still untangling. The forensic accountants estimated she'd stolen over $300,000 from various sources and evaded nearly $80,000 in taxes. What made the case particularly damning was the paper trail she'd left behind. Despite her attempts to cover her tracks, Vanessa had been remarkably sloppy with her record-keeping. She'd used the same computer to manage both legitimate business emails and fraudulent campaign communications. She'd deposited stolen funds into accounts that were clearly linked to her personal expenses. Most damaging of all, she'd been claiming tax deductions for business expenses that were actually being paid for with money stolen from fundraising campaigns. The day I testified before the grand jury was surreal. I sat in a windowless room facing 23 strangers who would decide whether there was enough evidence to formally charge my sister with federal crimes. They asked detailed questions about my relationship with Vanessa, the timeline of my cancer diagnosis and treatment, and exactly what I'd been told about the fundraising efforts. Did your sister ever indicate that she would be taking any portion of the donated money for her own use? I replied, never. She specifically told me multiple times that every penny would go toward my medical expenses and basic living costs during treatments. What was your understanding of how the tax implications would be handled? I assumed she was handling everything legally. When I asked about it once, she said the donations were below the threshold that would require special tax treatment and that she was keeping records for anything that might need to be reported. The prosecutor walked me through bank statements, email communications, and screenshots that painted a clear picture of deliberate deception. Looking at the evidence laid out like that, I realized how naive I'd been to trust someone so completely with something so important. The grand jury returned a true bill on all 18 charges 3 days later. Vanessa was arrested at her office on a Thursday morning, let out in handcuffs while her coworkers watched. The local news stations picked up the story that afternoon. Local marketing executive charged in massive charity fraud scheme. Seeing my sister's mugshot on the evening news felt like watching a stranger. But the criminal case was only half of my battle. The civil lawsuit David had filed was proceeding on a parallel track, and the discoveries we were making there added new dimensions to Vanessa's betrayal. She'd been living far beyond her legitimate means for years, using stolen money to maintain a luxury townhouse, expensive cars, and vacations that she'd posted about extensively on social media. The most painful revelation came when we obtained her credit card statements. During the months when I was going through chemotherapy and she was visiting me regularly, bringing me groceries and helping with household tasks, she'd been using my fundraising money to pay for those very groceries. She'd also been using it to cover her car payments, her mortgage, and even spa treatments that she'd gotten on days when she'd told me she was too busy with work to visit. She was literally using your cancer donations to fund her lifestyle while watching you worry about money, David said during one of our meetings. And then she was performing acts of generosity with money that was already yours to begin with. The betrayal had layers I was still discovering. Vanessa had been taking photos of herself helping me during treatment, bringing me meals, driving me to appointments, sitting with me during chemo sessions, and posting them on social media with captions about being a supportive sister during difficult times. She'd been building her public image as a caring family member while simultaneously stealing the money that people had donated to help me survive. As the federal case moved forward, more victims began coming forward.
The IRS investigation had uncovered at least 12 other fraudulent fundraising campaigns that Vanessa had managed over the years. There was Jennifer Martinez, whose son needed surgery for a birth defect. Vanessa had raised $15,000 and delivered only $8,000, keeping the rest. There was the Williams family, who'd lost their home in a fire. Vanessa had organized a neighborhood fundraiser that brought in $12,000, but the family only received $6,000. Each victim's story followed the same pattern. Vanessa would volunteer to help organize fundraising efforts, taking control of the money collection and distribution. She'd inflate the amounts being raised to make donors feel good about their contributions and victims feel hopeful about their situation. Then she'd skim anywhere from 20 to 40% off the top, using elaborate explanations about administrative costs, platform fees, and processing expenses to justify the missing money. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed aspects of Vanessa's personality that I'd never fully recognized. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a forensic psychologist who specialized in financial crimes, concluded that Vanessa exhibited traits consistent with narcissistic personality disorder and pathological lying. She had an inflated sense of her own importance, a need for constant admiration, and a willingness to exploit others to achieve her goals. Your sister appears to have genuinely believed that she was entitled to compensation for her fundraising work, Dr. Harper explained to me during a consultation. In her mind, she wasn't stealing. She was taking payment for services rendered. The fact that no one had agreed to pay her for these services didn't factor into her reasoning. This psychological profile helped explain some of Vanessa's behavior during our childhood that I'd dismissed as quirks. She'd always been the one to organize charity drives at school, positioning herself as the coordinator who decided how funds would be distributed. She'd been class treasurer multiple times and had always been involved in managing money for various clubs and activities. I'd admired her leadership abilities, but looking back, I wondered if there had been red flags I'd missed. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for early October, and Prosecutor Rodriguez warned me that Vanessa's defense team would likely try to paint me as a vindictive sister who was exaggerating the financial impact of what they'd characterize as a family misunderstanding. Her lead attorney, Robert Kim, had a reputation for aggressive tactics and had already begun reaching out to mutual friends and family members, apparently fishing for information that might undermine my credibility. The stress of the legal proceedings was taking a toll on my health. My oncologist had been monitoring some concerning changes in my blood work, and she was worried that the emotional trauma was interfering with my recovery. The irony wasn't lost on me. The stress of dealing with my sister's theft from my cancer fund was potentially making my cancer worse. But there was also an unexpected silver lining. The publicity around the case had led to genuine donations from people who were outraged by what had happened. A local news anchor had mentioned my situation during a segment about charity fraud, and viewers had started sending checks directly to my medical providers. The real GoFundMe page that I'd finally set up myself was growing steadily, with donors specifically noting that they wanted to help after learning how I'd been betrayed. 3 weeks before the preliminary hearing, Vanessa's attorney reached out to David about a possible plea deal. She was willing to plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for making full restitution to all victims and accepting a shorter prison sentence. The prosecutor was considering it because it would guarantee convictions and recovery of stolen money, but she wanted input from the victims before making a decision. "What do you think?" David asked me. "A plea deal would mean she serves probably 5 to 7 years instead of 15 to 20, but you'd get your money back faster, and you wouldn't have to go through the stress of a trial." I found myself facing a decision I'd never anticipated. Did I want to see my sister get the maximum punishment possible, or was it more important to recover the money and move on with my life? The answer would determine not just Vanessa's fate, but also how I wanted to define this chapter of my own story. The decision about the plea deal consumed my thoughts for days. I found myself walking through the desert trails behind my apartment complex at sunrise, trying to sort through emotions that seemed to change by the hour. Part of me wanted Vanessa to face the full consequences of what she'd done, not just to me, but to all the families she'd stolen from over the years. But another part of me was exhausted by the legal battles and desperate to get the money I needed for my ongoing medical care. My next oncology appointment made the decision more urgent. Dr. Martinez had been monitoring some irregularities in my latest scans, and he wanted to schedule additional tests that would cost nearly $8,000 up front. My insurance was covering the basic treatment protocol, but these specialized diagnostics fell into a gray area that required pre-authorization they weren't willing to provide.
I know the timing is difficult, Dr. Martinez said carefully, but we really need to rule out some possibilities sooner rather than later. He didn't need to spell out what those possibilities were. After 18 months of treatment, we both knew that any new developments could mean my cancer had found a way to adapt or spread. The tests needed to happen within the next 3 weeks. That evening, I called David to discuss the plea agreement details. Prosecutor Rodriguez had outlined specific terms. Vanessa would plead guilty to 5 federal charges instead of 18, serve a minimum of 6 years in federal prison, and pay full restitution of $420,000 to all victims within 90 days. The restitution amount was higher than the original theft total because it included interest, penalties, and compensation for victims' additional expenses caused by the delays. The good news is that she apparently has assets we didn't know about, David explained. Her attorney provided documentation showing she has investments, a second property in Flagstaff, and some kind of inheritance from an aunt that she never mentioned. If she liquidates everything, she can actually cover the full restitution amount. This information hit me like a physical blow. While I'd been struggling to pay for basic cancer treatment, worrying about every medical bill and rationing my medications to make them last longer, Vanessa had been sitting on hidden assets worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. She could have returned my money at any point during the past year and still maintained her comfortable lifestyle. Why didn't she just pay it back when I first confronted her? I asked David. Because admitting she had the money would have meant admitting the scope of what she'd done, he replied. As long as she could claim financial hardship, she could maintain the fiction that this was all just a temporary mistake she'd fix eventually. The revelation about her hidden assets changed how I felt about the plea deal. It wasn't really about mercy or moving on. It was about ensuring that justice was served efficiently. Vanessa clearly had the means to make full restitution, and a guaranteed 6-year sentence would still send a strong message about the consequences of charity fraud. I told David to inform the prosecutor that I supported accepting the plea agreement, but I wanted to address the court during Vanessa's sentencing hearing. If she was going to avoid the full 20-year sentence she deserved, I wanted to make sure the judge understood exactly what her crimes had cost her victims, both financially and emotionally. The plea hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I wasn't required to attend, but I wanted to see Vanessa face the consequences of her choices. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with wood paneling that made everything feel formal and somber. Vanessa sat at the defendant's table wearing a navy blue suit that probably cost more than I'd spent on clothes in the past 2 years. She looked thinner than when I'd last seen her, and her normally perfect hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. When Judge Patricia Hawkins asked if she understood the charges against her, Vanessa's voice was barely audible. "Yes, Your Honor." "And how do you plead to the charge of conspiracy to commit wire fraud?" "Guilty, Your Honor." Hearing her actually say the word guilty felt anticlimactic. After months of legal maneuvering and denials, the acknowledgement of her crimes came in a whisper that barely carried across the courtroom. She pleaded guilty to all 5 charges in the same quiet voice, never once looking toward the gallery where I was sitting. The most surreal moment came when her attorney, Robert Kim, began outlining the factors they wanted the court to consider during sentencing. He painted a picture of Vanessa as someone who'd made poor decisions during a period of personal financial stress, emphasizing her previously clean record and her contributions to the community through various volunteer activities. "Mrs. Chen has been a pillar of her community," Kim said, somehow managing to keep a straight face. She organized numerous charitable efforts and helped raise money for worthy causes throughout her career. I wanted to stand up and scream that those charitable efforts were exactly how she'd learned to steal from people, but courtroom decorum kept me in my seat. The attorney was technically telling the truth while completely ignoring the context that made it meaningless. Prosecutor Rodriguez's response was more satisfying.
She systematically outlined the scope of Vanessa's fraud, the number of victims affected, and the particularly egregious nature of stealing from medical fundraising campaigns. She presented evidence that this wasn't impulsive behavior during a financial crisis, but a calculated pattern of exploitation that had been going on for years. The defendant didn't just steal money, Your Honor, Rodriguez said. She stole hope from families in crisis. She betrayed trust in the charitable donation system that communities rely on to help their most vulnerable members. Her actions have made it harder for legitimate charity efforts to succeed because donors now question whether their contributions will actually reach the intended recipients. The hearing ended with Judge Hawkins scheduling the sentencing for 6 weeks later, giving the probation office time to prepare a pre-sentence investigation report. As Vanessa was led out of the courtroom, she finally looked in my direction. For just a moment, our eyes met, and I saw something that might have been regret, but it might also have been self-pity. After everything that had happened, I was no longer sure I could read my sister's expressions accurately.
The weeks leading up to sentencing brought unexpected developments. The IRS completed their audit of Vanessa's finances and discovered additional unreported income that pushed her total tax liability to over $100,000. They also found evidence that she'd been claiming fraudulent business deductions for years, using fake receipts and inflated expense reports to reduce her taxable income. More significantly, the investigation had attracted the attention of the Arizona Attorney General's office, which was considering additional state charges related to charity fraud. If they decided to prosecute, Vanessa could be facing several more years in state prison on top of her federal sentence. David kept me updated on these developments, but I found myself feeling oddly detached from the escalating legal consequences. My focus had shifted to something more personal and immediate, rebuilding my relationship with trust itself. The betrayal by my sister had left me suspicious of everyone's motives, questioning whether other people in my life might also be harboring hidden agendas. This paranoia was affecting my recovery in unexpected ways. I'd become reluctant to accept help from friends and neighbors, even for simple things like grocery shopping or rides to medical appointments. When my oncology social worker suggested joining a cancer support group, I declined because I couldn't shake the fear that someone might try to take advantage of the vulnerabilities that cancer patients shared in those settings. My therapist, Dr. Susan Walsh, helped me understand that Vanessa's betrayal had damaged more than just my finances. It had shaken my fundamental ability to trust my own judgment about people. When someone close to us violates our trust in such a profound way, she explained, it makes us question our ability to accurately assess other people's character. You're not just dealing with the financial theft, you're dealing with the theft of your confidence in your own perceptions. The therapeutic work was slow and difficult, but it was helping me distinguish between reasonable caution and destructive paranoia. I was learning to rebuild trust gradually, starting with small interactions and working up to more significant relationships. 3 days before Vanessa's sentencing hearing, I received an unexpected letter from her. It had been mailed from the county jail where she was being held pending sentencing, and my first instinct was to throw it away without reading it. But curiosity won out, and I opened it in my kitchen while drinking my morning coffee. The letter was 3 pages of handwritten apologies and explanations that read like a therapy assignment. Vanessa claimed to have found religion in jail and was attending counseling sessions that had helped her understand the depth of harm she'd caused. She wrote about childhood resentments and financial pressures that had led to her poor decisions. She promised that she was a changed person who would spend the rest of her life making amends for what she'd done. But what struck me most was what the letter didn't contain. There was no acknowledgement of the specific impact her actions had on my health and recovery. There was no recognition that her theft had forced me to delay critical medical treatments. There was no understanding that her betrayal during my cancer battle had caused psychological trauma that would take years to heal. The letter felt like one final act of selfishness, an attempt to ease her own guilt rather than a genuine expression of remorse for the harm she'd caused. I folded it up and put it in the file with all the other legal documents from the case. Whatever Vanessa needed to tell herself to sleep at night in prison was her business, but I was done letting her words affect my emotional state.
Sentencing day was finally here, and I was ready to close this chapter of my life. The federal courthouse felt different on sentencing day. The same marble corridors and imposing architecture were there, but now they represented the end of a journey rather than the beginning of one. I'd prepared my victim impact statement for weeks, revising it countless times to strike the right balance between honest emotion and factual recounting of how Vanessa's crimes had affected my life. Judge Hawkins' courtroom was more crowded than it had been during the plea hearing. Several other victims had come to watch the sentencing, including Jennifer Martinez, whose son's surgery had been delayed because of Vanessa's theft from his medical fund. The Williams family was there too, the couple whose house fire fundraiser had been compromised. Seeing these other victims reinforced that this case was bigger than just my personal betrayal. Vanessa entered the courtroom wearing the same navy suit from the plea hearing, but she looked even more diminished than before. 6 weeks in county jail awaiting sentencing had taken a visible toll. Her attorney, Robert Kim, had clearly coached her on courtroom demeanor. She kept her eyes downcast and her hands folded, projecting what I assumed was supposed to be contrition. The probation officer's pre-sentence report painted a detailed picture of Vanessa's financial crimes and their impact. The investigation had ultimately identified 14 separate victims across 7 years, with total theft amounts reaching $460,000. The report also included psychological evaluations, diagnosed her with narcissistic personality disorder, and recommended extensive counseling as part of any sentence. Prosecutor Rodriguez addressed the court first, emphasizing the calculated nature of Vanessa's crimes and their devastating impact on vulnerable families. Your Honor, the defendant didn't steal money from banks or corporations that could absorb the losses. She specifically targeted people in medical crises, families who had lost their homes, and communities trying to help their most vulnerable members. She turned their generosity and compassion into weapons against them. Robert Kim's defense presentation focused on Vanessa's previously clean record and the financial pressures that had allegedly led to her poor decisions. He presented character letters
From former colleagues and neighbors who described her as helpful and community-minded. The irony of using her reputation for charitable work as a mitigating factor wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. My client recognizes the gravity of her mistakes, Kim argued. She's prepared to make full restitution and has already begun liquidating assets to ensure that every victim receives complete compensation. She's asking the court for an opportunity to rebuild her life and continue making amends for her actions. Then came the victim impact statements. Jennifer Martinez spoke first, describing how the delay in her son's surgery had caused him additional pain and required a more complex procedure when it was finally performed. Her voice cracked when she talked about having to explain to her 8-year-old why the money people had donated to help him wasn't actually available. The Williams family chose to have their statement read by Prosecutor Rodriguez, since they were too emotional to speak in court themselves. Their statement detailed not just the financial impact of the theft, but the way it had affected their faith in their community's support system. They'd received additional donations after learning about the fraud, but the betrayal had left lasting scars on their ability to trust others during times of vulnerability. When Judge Hawkins called my name, I walked to the podium with hands that were steadier than I'd expected. Looking directly at Vanessa, I began reading the statement I'd crafted so carefully. Your Honor, when I was diagnosed with cancer, my biggest fear wasn't dying. It was becoming a burden on the people I loved. I was terrified of having to ask family and friends for help with medical bills I couldn't afford. When my sister offered to handle fundraising for my treatment, I thought I was receiving the greatest gift possible, the ability to focus on healing instead of worrying about money. Instead, Vanessa turned my cancer into her personal opportunity for financial gain. While I was lying in hospital beds receiving chemotherapy, she was using money donated for my treatment to pay for her spa visits and luxury purchases. While I was rationing my medications to make them last longer, she was taking vacations funded by my cancer donations. But the financial theft was only part of the damage she caused. Vanessa stole my ability to trust my own judgment about people. She stole my faith in family loyalty during the most vulnerable period of my life.
She stole my peace of mind during a time when I needed all my emotional energy for fighting cancer. The defendant has never acknowledged the full scope of harm she caused. Her recent letter to me was filled with self-pity and excuses, but contained no real understanding of how her actions affected my health and recovery. She seems to view herself as someone who made mistakes under pressure, rather than someone who systematically exploited people in crisis for years. I'm asking the court to consider not just the financial crimes, but the profound breach of trust that occurred when someone chose to profit from other people's medical emergencies. This sentencing is about more than punishment. It's about protecting future victims and restoring faith in the charitable donation system that communities depend on. Vanessa's reaction to my statement was the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her during any of the proceedings. She was crying, not the controlled tears of someone trying to influence a judge, but the raw sobbing of someone finally confronting the reality of what she'd done. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old sympathy I'd once had for her. But then, I remembered the spa receipts paid for with my cancer fund, and the sympathy faded. Judge Hawkins allowed Vanessa to make a statement before sentencing. She stood at the podium with her attorney beside her, speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "Your Honor, I want to apologize to my sister and all the other victims. I know that words can't undo the harm I've caused, but I need them to know that I never intended for things to go as far as they did. I started down this path during a period of financial stress, and I kept making worse and worse decisions trying to cover up my initial mistakes. I've had a lot of time to think about my actions over the past few months, and I understand now that I was stealing more than just money. I was stealing trust and hope from people who were already suffering. I was betraying the generosity that communities show to their members in need. I'm committed to making full restitution to every victim, and I've already begun liquidating my assets to ensure that happens as quickly as possible. I know I'll be going to prison, and I accept that consequence. I hope that someday, after I've served my sentence and made amends, I might be able to earn some measure of forgiveness." Judge Hawkins took a 15-minute recess before announcing the sentence. When court reconvened, her demeanor was stern as she addressed Vanessa directly. "Miss Chen, your crimes represent a profound betrayal of community trust. You specifically targeted people in medical crises and families facing emergencies, turning their most vulnerable moments into opportunities for personal profit. The systematic nature of your fraud, spanning multiple years and numerous victims, demonstrates that this was not aberrant behavior during a period of stress, but a calculated pattern of exploitation in crisis. However, I also note your acceptance of responsibility through your guilty plea, your commitment to full restitution, and the lack of any prior criminal history. Taking all factors into consideration, I sentence you to 7 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. You are ordered to pay full restitution of $460,000 to all victims within 120 days.
The sentence was longer than the minimum we'd expected from the plea agreement, but shorter than the maximum she could have received. Judge Hawkins explained that the additional year was due to the medical nature of the fundraising campaigns Vanessa had targeted. As the bailiff led Vanessa away, she looked back at me one final time. There was something different in her expression, not the self-pity I'd seen before, but what might have been genuine remorse. Whether that remorse was real or just another performance, I'd probably never know. David walked me out of the courthouse into the bright Arizona sunshine. "How do you feel?" he asked. I thought about the question as we stood on the courthouse steps. I felt relieved that the legal proceedings were finally over. I felt vindicated that Vanessa's crimes had been formally acknowledged and punished. But mostly, I felt ready to focus on my own healing, both physical and emotional. The restitution money would arrive within 4 months, finally allowing me to complete my medical treatments without financial stress. More importantly, the closure of the legal case meant I could stop defining myself as a victim of fraud and start rebuilding my identity as a cancer survivor who'd overcome extraordinary obstacles. 3 months later, I received notice that the full restitution amount had been deposited into my account.
Vanessa had kept her promise about liquidating her assets, selling her townhouse, her rental property in Flagstaff, and various investments to cover the court-ordered payments. That evening, I made two important phone calls. The first was to Dr. Martinez's office to schedule the specialized tests I'd been postponing for over a year. The second was to the local cancer support center, where I volunteered to help other patients navigate the financial challenges of treatment. If Vanessa's betrayal had taught me anything, it was that trust, once broken, had to be rebuilt deliberately and carefully. But it also taught me that healing required not just recovering what was stolen, but finding ways to transform the experience into something that could help others. The woman who'd stolen from my cancer fund was now serving 7 years in federal prison. But the cancer survivor who'd fought back and won was finally ready to move forward with her life. 2 years after Vanessa's sentencing, I thought the legal nightmare was finally behind me. I'd completed my cancer treatment successfully, the restitution money had allowed me to pay off all my medical debts, and I'd even started a small nonprofit to help other cancer patients navigate financial challenges during treatment. Life was moving forward in ways I hadn't dared to hope for during those dark months of betrayal and legal battles. Then Agent Williams called again. "Miss Thompson, I'm sorry to contact you after all this time, but we've uncovered some new information about your sister's case that requires your attention," she said during that Tuesday morning phone call that would upend my carefully rebuilt sense of security. The IRS investigation into Vanessa's financial crimes had apparently never fully closed. While she was serving her federal sentence at the Women's Correctional Facility in Dublin, California, forensic accountants had continued analyzing her financial records as part of a broader investigation into charity fraud networks. What they discovered was both shocking and somehow predictable given everything I'd learned about my sister. "We found evidence that Vanessa was part of a larger organized scheme," Agent Williams explained during our meeting at the Phoenix IRS office the following week. "She wasn't just a lone fraudster taking advantage of charitable donations. She was connected to a network of individuals who were systematically targeting medical fundraising campaigns across multiple states." The investigation had uncovered communications between Vanessa and at least 6 other people who were running similar schemes in different cities. They'd been sharing strategies for identifying vulnerable targets, techniques for manipulating fundraising platforms, and methods for laundering the stolen money through various business entities. What I'd thought was my sister's individual moral failure was actually part of a coordinated criminal enterprise. "How long had this been going on?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Based on the digital evidence we've recovered, at least 10 years, Agent Williams replied. "Your sister appears to have been one of the more successful operators in the network. She was particularly skilled at building trust with victims and maintaining long-term deceptions." The scope of the additional crimes was staggering. The network had stolen an estimated $1.8 million from medical fundraising campaigns across Arizona, Nevada, California, and New Mexico. They targeted everything from childhood cancer cases to veterans' medical expenses to elderly patients needing emergency surgery. The federal authorities were now pursuing a massive RICO case that could result in additional charges for everyone involved. This revelation meant that Vanessa's 7-year sentence was about to become significantly longer. RICO charges carried their own penalties, and participating in an organized criminal enterprise was treated much more seriously than individual fraud cases. Agent Williams estimated that Vanessa could be facing an additional 10 to 15 years in federal prison. But the personal implications for me were even more complex. As the investigation expanded, federal authorities needed detailed testimony about Vanessa's methods and timeline. They wanted me to review hundreds of emails, financial documents, and communications records to help establish patterns of behavior that could be used against the other network members.
I understand this is a lot to ask, Agent Williams said. You've already been through so much with the original case. But your testimony could be crucial for stopping this network from victimizing more families. The decision felt overwhelming. I'd spent 2 years rebuilding my life and learning to trust again. The thought of diving back into the details of Vanessa's deceptions and expanding my understanding of how calculated her betrayal had been was emotionally exhausting just to consider.
My therapist, Dr. Walsh, helped me work through the competing feelings during several intensive sessions. "You're not obligated to help with this expanded investigation," she reminded me. "You've already done more than enough. But if you choose to participate, it needs to be for your own reasons, not out of guilt or pressure from the authorities." What ultimately convinced me to cooperate was learning about some of the other victims in the network. There was a family in Las Vegas whose premature twin daughters had needed specialized treatment. The network had stolen over $40,000 from their fundraising campaign, forcing the parents to take out crushing loans that eventually led to bankruptcy. There was a veteran in Albuquerque whose traumatic brain injury fundraiser had been compromised, delaying his access to experimental treatment that might have improved his cognitive function. These weren't abstract victims, they were real families whose lives had been devastated by the same type of calculated exploitation I'd experienced. If my testimony could help ensure that the people responsible faced appropriate consequences, then the emotional cost of revisiting my sister's crimes seemed worth it. The expanded investigation revealed disturbing details about how the network operated. They'd developed sophisticated techniques for identifying promising targets, often monitoring social media posts and local news stories to find people facing medical crises. They'd created templates for approaching families and offering to help with fundraising efforts. Most disturbingly, they'd shared information about which types of medical conditions generated the most sympathy and donations from the public. Vanessa's role in the network was more significant than I'd realized. Email records showed that she'd been mentoring newer members, teaching them how to build trust with victims and avoid detection by fundraising platforms. She'd been receiving percentage cuts from other members' fraudulent campaigns in exchange for her expertise. In the criminal hierarchy of the organization, she wasn't just a participant, she was a leader. This information fundamentally changed how I viewed my sister's crimes against me. What I'd thought was a desperate woman making increasingly bad decisions to cover up an initial mistake was actually a calculated predator who'd specifically chosen to target her own sister because she knew exactly how to exploit my trust and vulnerability. The psychological impact of this realization was more devastating than the original betrayal had been. During my cancer treatment, even after discovering the theft, I'd maintained some belief that Vanessa's actions came from a place of desperation rather than malice. Learning that she'd been a professional fraudster who deliberately targeted me as an optimal victim stripped away the last vestiges of sympathy I'd held for her. Dr. Walsh helped me understand that this new information didn't invalidate the healing work I'd already done. "Your recovery from the original betrayal was real and meaningful," she explained. "This additional information is painful, but it doesn't undo the progress you've made. If anything, it confirms that your decision to cut ties with your sister was the right one." The federal grand jury proceedings for the RICO case lasted 3 months. I testified multiple times, walking juries through the timeline of my sister's deceptions and explaining how her techniques had evolved over the years I'd known her. The prosecutors used my case as a template for understanding how the network targeted and manipulated victims. Vanessa's federal public defender tried to argue that she'd been coerced into participating in the network by more sophisticated criminals, but the evidence clearly showed her leadership role. Email records included messages where she'd boasted about her success rates and offered advice to struggling network members about how to maintain victims' trust during extended fraud campaigns. The trial revealed that the network had been incredibly sophisticated in their approach to money laundering. They'd set up a web of shell companies, fake charities, and offshore accounts to hide stolen funds. They'd used cryptocurrency exchanges and peer-to-peer payment platforms to make financial tracking more difficult. Some members had even filed fraudulent tax returns, claiming deductions for charitable donations they'd never actually made. During her testimony via video link from prison, Vanessa attempted to minimize her role in the network, claiming she'd only participated because she was desperate for money to pay back the victims from her individual cases. But prosecutors presented evidence showing that she'd been active in the network years before she'd ever stolen from my cancer fund. The most damaging evidence came from recordings that one network member had made as part of a cooperation agreement with federal authorities. In these conversations, Vanessa could be heard discussing strategies for targeting cancer patients specifically because they're the most desperate and grateful for help, so they ask fewer questions about the details. Hearing my sister's voice casually discussing techniques for exploiting cancer patients felt like being diagnosed all over again. The woman I'd thought I knew, even accounting for her individual crimes against me, had been a stranger all along. She'd built her criminal expertise by studying the vulnerabilities of people in medical crises and developing methods to exploit their desperation. The RICO case concluded with convictions for all 7 network members. Vanessa received an additional 12-year sentence to run consecutively with her original 7 years, meaning she'd be in federal prison for a total of 19 years. At 42 years old, she wouldn't be eligible for release until she was 61. The other network members received sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years. The federal judge overseeing the case called their operation a systematic attack on the charitable impulses that bind communities together during times of crisis. Standing outside the federal courthouse after the final sentencing, I realized that this second round of legal proceedings had brought a different kind of closure than the first. The original case had been about justice for Vanessa's individual crimes against me and other direct victims. This case was about protecting future victims and dismantling a criminal enterprise that had been destroying families for over a decade. Agent Williams shook my hand as we prepared to leave the courthouse for the final time. "Your cooperation was instrumental in this case," she said. "The network was planning to expand their operations into elder care fundraising. Your testimony helped us stop that before it could start." The thought that my willingness to relive painful memories had prevented other families from experiencing similar betrayals made the emotional cost feel worthwhile. But more than that, it helped me understand that my sister's crimes against me had been part of something much larger and more calculated than I'd ever imagined. That evening, I updated the blog I'd been writing about my experience with charity fraud. Over the past 2 years, it had become a resource for other victims and a way for me to process my ongoing healing journey. The post about the RICO case results would be difficult to write, but I knew it was important for people to understand how sophisticated these criminal networks could be. The final chapter of my legal battles with Vanessa was now closed, but the work of helping other victims and rebuilding trust in charitable donation systems was just beginning. 5 years have passed since I first discovered that my sister had been stealing from my cancer fund. As I sit in my office at the Phoenix Cancer Financial Advocacy Center, the nonprofit I founded with part of the restitution money, I sometimes struggle to believe how dramatically my life has changed since those dark days of betrayal and legal battles. The center has grown from a small operation run out of my apartment to a full-service organization with 12 staff members and satellite offices in Tucson and Flagstaff. We've helped over 2,000 cancer patients navigate financial challenges during their treatment, and we've recovered more than $1.2 million in fraudulent charges and billing errors that insurance companies and medical providers were trying to pass on to vulnerable patients. But the work isn't just about money. Every week, I meet with cancer patients who are struggling with the same feelings of helplessness and financial panic that I experienced during my own diagnosis. The difference is that now I can offer them something I didn't have: practical knowledge about navigating the system and emotional support from someone who's been through the worst-case scenario and survived. Last month, I received a letter that I never expected to see. It came from the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California, where Vanessa is serving her 19-year sentence. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I worked up the courage to open it. The letter was different from the self-serving apology she'd sent before her original sentencing. This one was shorter, more direct, and focused entirely on acknowledging the harm she'd caused rather than explaining or justifying her actions. "Rachel," it began, "I know I have no right to contact you, and I understand if you choose not to read this or respond. I've been in prison for over 4 years now, and I've had a lot of time to think about what I did to you and all the other families I hurt. I want you to know that I finally understand the full scope of the damage I caused. It wasn't just about the money I stole, though that was terrible enough. I betrayed your trust during the most vulnerable period of your life. I turned your cancer diagnosis into my opportunity for profit. I violated the bond between sisters when you needed family support the most. I've been following news about your advocacy center through articles I found in the prison library. Reading about the work you're doing to help other cancer patients made me realize something important. You turned the worst thing I did to you into something that helps other people. You found a way to transform betrayal into purpose. I'm not writing this letter to ask for forgiveness or to try to rebuild our relationship. I know that's not possible, and I'm not sure I deserve it anyway. I'm writing because I wanted you to know that your strength in surviving what I did to you has taught me something about the kind of person I should have been all along. I hope you're healthy and happy. I hope your advocacy work continues to grow and help more families. And I hope that someday, when you think about having a sister, the pain I caused will be overshadowed by the good you've created in response to it. The letter was signed simply Vanessa, with no flowery closings or attempts at intimacy. Reading it brought up complicated emotions I thought I'd resolved years ago. There was relief that she finally seemed to understand the full impact of her crimes. There was sadness for the relationship we might have had if she'd made different choices. And there was a strange kind of pride that my work was visible enough for her to learn about it even from prison. But mostly, I felt a sense of completion. This letter represented the final piece of closure I hadn't realized I was still waiting for. Vanessa had acknowledged not just the financial theft, but the deeper betrayal of family trust that had been the most painful part of her crimes. I showed the letter to Dr. Walsh during our quarterly check-in session. Even 5 years later, I still met with her periodically to process new challenges and maintain the emotional health I'd worked so hard to rebuild.
How does it feel to receive that acknowledgement? She asked. Validating, I said after thinking about it for a moment. For years, I wondered if she really understood what she'd done to me, or if she just saw it as a financial crime that got out of hand. This letter suggests she finally gets the deeper betrayal. Does it change how you feel about her? That was a harder question. It doesn't make me want to forgive her or rebuild a relationship, I said carefully, but it does make me feel like the person I grew up with wasn't completely gone. She was buried under years of criminal behavior and narcissistic thinking, but some part of her was still capable of genuine reflection and remorse. Does it change how you feel about her? That was a harder question. It doesn't make me want to forgive her or rebuild a relationship, I said carefully, but it does make me feel like the person I grew up with wasn't completely gone. She was buried under years of criminal behavior and narcissistic thinking, but some part of her was still capable of genuine reflection and remorse. Dr. Walsh nodded. That's a very mature way to process it. You're able to acknowledge her growth without feeling obligated to respond to it or change your own boundaries. Indeed, I had no intention of responding to Vanessa's letter. The acknowledgement was meaningful, but it didn't create any obligation for me to engage with her. My healing hadn't depended on her understanding, and my future didn't require her participation. The Advocacy Center has become my life's work in ways I never anticipated. What started as a response to my own victimization has evolved into a comprehensive approach to helping cancer patients protect themselves from financial exploitation. We've developed educational materials about charity fraud, created resources for verifying fundraising campaigns, and established protocols for patients to safely accept community support during treatment. Our fraud prevention work has attracted national attention. I've testified before congressional subcommittees about medical charity fraud and worked with federal agencies to develop better oversight procedures for fundraising platforms. The techniques that Vanessa's network used to exploit cancer patients have been largely neutralized by new verification requirements and monitoring systems that grew out of our advocacy efforts. But the most rewarding part of the work isn't the policy changes or media recognition. It's the individual patients we help every day. Last week, I met with a young father named Marcus, whose leukemia treatment was being delayed because his insurance company was refusing to cover an experimental therapy. Our team was able to help him appeal the denial and identify grant programs that covered the remaining costs. His treatment started 3 days later.
Stories like Marcus's remind me why I chose to transform my experience with betrayal into a mission of service. Every patient we help represents someone who won't have to experience the financial desperation that made me vulnerable to my sister's exploitation. Every fraud case we prevent represents a family that won't have to endure the secondary trauma of discovering that their charitable donations were stolen. The work has also connected me with an incredible community of other advocates and survivors. Through the center, I've met people who've overcome every type of medical and financial challenge imaginable. Their resilience and creativity in rebuilding their lives have taught me that healing isn't just about recovering from trauma, it's about discovering strengths you didn't know you possessed. My own health remained stable 5 years after completing treatment. The specialized tests that I was finally able to afford with the restitution money have all been clear, and my oncologist considers me fully cured. The physical scars from surgery have faded, and the emotional scars from betrayal have been transformed into wisdom that helps other people navigate similar challenges. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have looked like if Vanessa had never stolen from my cancer fund. Would I have returned to freelance graphic design? Would I have remained focused on my own small world of personal and professional concerns? The betrayal was devastating when it happened, but it also forced me to develop resilience, advocacy skills, and a sense of purpose that has made my life more meaningful than I ever imagined possible. That doesn't mean I'm grateful for what happened. The trauma was real, and the damage to my ability to trust took years to repair. But I am proud of what I've built in response to it. The center, the advocacy work, the thousands of patients we've helped, none of that would exist if I hadn't experienced the worst-case scenario of family betrayal and decided to fight back. As I finish writing this account of my experience, I'm aware that sharing these details publicly represents another step in my healing journey. For 5 years, I've helped other people tell their stories and find their voices in advocating for better treatment. Now, I'm using my own voice to ensure that the lessons learned from my sister's crimes can help protect other families from similar exploitation. The woman who once lay in a hospital bed wondering how she'd pay for cancer treatment while her sister stole donations meant to save her life has become someone who helps other people navigate their own darkest moments. The betrayal that nearly destroyed my faith in human goodness has become the foundation for work that restores hope to families facing impossible challenges. Vanessa will be in federal prison until she's 61 years old. By the time she's released, I'll be in my 50s, and the Advocacy Center will hopefully be a national organization helping cancer patients across the country. The 19 years she'll spend paying for her crimes will be 19 years I'll spend preventing other families from experiencing similar victimization. That feels like justice. Not just the legal consequences she's facing, but the transformation of her destructive choices into something that protects and empowers other people. Her legacy will be one of exploitation and betrayal. Mine will be one of service and advocacy. And in the end, that makes all the pain she caused worth something more than just survival. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.